Hi, this is Shane Thomas. Do you love history? Do you feel that single events in the past have a role in shaping the world in the future? Then stick around and tune into
Back to the
Past, Present, and
Future,
the show that takes a specific decade in history and discusses 2 to 3 events and how they changed history from then on. So sit tight and let's explore the past on Back to the Past, Present, and Future. Hey everyone, how you doing out there? If you like history and want to know how it affects the events of today, then you found the right podcast for you. On this first episode, we're going to be digging deep into the 1930s and 40s and looking at the events of these decades that still resonate with us decades later, including the Hindenburg explosion, the Great Depression, and World War II. Have you ever walked down the hallway of an airport boarding gate and wondered why so many people take airplanes as a form of transportation? Well, for a short while, that reality almost ceased to exist. During a good portion of the 1930s, before there were jet and propeller-powered airplanes, people thought that blimps and zeppelins would be the future of air travel, according to an article I read recently from citymetric.com. But the Hindenburg changed all that because of its explosion accident that occurred in 1937, in which resulted in 35 of its 97 passengers being killed, also including one ground member. Could you imagine having hundreds of these giant things roaming the skies above you? Talk about shady. According to Business Insider, they never found the cause of the explosion, but one cause was thought to have been due to the flammable hydrogen being used in place of helium because it was hard to get a hold of. In this occurring, it allowed airplanes to eventually control the skies, giving countries the ability to eventually evolve them through World War II, which we will talk about later, into the Superjet F-22 Raptors and the Boeing 787s that roam the skies each and every day. Now, though the Hindenburg was an important event, the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl affected the United States specifically throughout the 1930s. The Great Depression has a great, there I go again, overusing words, relevance even to this day for some, because there are people who are still alive who still keep their earned money at home. We are all aware of this, but what makes this important? It's that all those people typically grew up or began working during most of the 1930s and the time leading up to the Second World War. So going through a time like that where you were basically spending each and every day begging people for a job that most people knew would never be found, because at that time, over 20% of the U.S. population, 20%, that's crazy, at that time were either homeless or on the verge of being homeless. Though there was unemployment at the start of the Depression, the problem worsened when the Dust Bowl began in the Great Plains. Began in 1930, the Dust Bowl, which deepened the economic problem, originated from the period following the Civil War when people began settling the West, specifically the Great Plains. This affected the area because of its excess farming and plowing. This, in turn, caused topsoil to dry up. Why does this matter? It matters because if you don't have topsoil, you can't grow things. If you can't grow things, you don't have food to eat. This worsened the economic problem because by 1934, 10% of farmers at the time resulted in selling off their farms, causing the number of homeless people to rise. It was not until the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932 that conditions would slowly begin to better themselves. One thing that people learned from this tragedy that they still do today was that in order to keep the soil from drying up, the agricultural industry readjusted farming techniques. One way they did this, according to USHistory.com, was having the newly founded Civilian Conservation Corps plant a huge line of trees spanning from Canada to Texas. In doing this, the trees blocked the wind and held water in the soil to keep water in place, and plants were required to be rotated each season to rejuvenate the soil. It's kind of like if you use the same pan for cooking each night, it eventually becomes unusable. One way that this ecological and economic disaster affected an entire generation of people from that era was that people had to grow up witnessing their parents going through this. This gave them the sense of hopelessness, making them want to work even harder. This sense of work ethic was carried by some people through their adult life into their older age years. That hard work ethic, generated by some during the Great Depression, was what will get the U.S. through the fight to come, which is where we continue on to the 1940s. The 1940s was host to some of the most horrifying and exciting events in human history. Some of these events include the Holocaust, Pearl Harbor, D-Day, and the Second World War as a whole. This is where it gets interesting. The 1940s started out as any other decade in history. The United States was still in the grips of the Great Depression. The Great Plains were still barren, but they were improving thanks to aid from the government led by second-term elected President Roosevelt. But there was a secret force at bay that we still are afraid of to this day. While the U.S. was relaxing soundly, Germany and its newly elected Chancellor, Adolf Hitler, was rallying his loyal Nazi party to conquer their land back. The British requested that the U.S. join their fight, but most people at the time felt that the military didn't need to fight in their war, and that the war was Europe's problem, a decision that we will soon regret. It was finally because of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 that the notion of isolationism in America went away. The attack claimed the lives of over 2,000 American servicemen, mostly Navy. Think about it. That's the population of a small town. Since World War II, the United States military has never denied an Allied aid when it really needed it. After Pearl Harbor, both Germany and Japan felt the complete power of the American economical and military power. When the United States entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the entire American economy was thrown behind the war effort. Factories that used to be closed due to the Depression were building equipment specifically for the war. Equipment such as tanks, machine guns, and you betcha, the SUV that everyone in America is familiar with, the Jeep. Standing for General Purpose Vehicle, the Jeep was so revolutionary that it jump-started an entirely new breed of automobile. Before being known as the Wrangler JK, the Jeep was the champion of the Second World War. The vehicle was used so that the soldiers would be able to travel anywhere off-road and on. It was so popular that it was driven by soldiers even after the war was over. While the Jeep was popular, the enemy that the Jeep helped the Allies defeat were the Nazis. The Nazis were most likely the most notorious army that the United States has fought and who we will probably ever fight. Under the Nazis, over 6 million people lost their lives solely because they didn't fit with what the group thought was the perfect person. This is what was classified as the Holocaust. This sole event is taught in every school to children at a relatively young age due to the horrific lengths the Nazis were willing to go through to build their perfect race. The Second World War was so eye-opening to the world that the United States took it as a sign that it is our responsibility and sacred duty to work with other nations to make certain that something such as this would never occur again. The United Nations were also created solely in response to World War II, and because it was due to the world looking away that these crimes were allowed to proceed. That is why nowadays you see UN peacekeeping initiatives and why the UN fought Saddam Hussein as a group during the Gulf War. They did it because they work better as a group rather than one nation working alone. In winning what was known as the deadliest war in history, the win gave the Allied powers a new sense of pride and excitement for the future. It also symbolized a new era for military strength, specifically for the United States. By defeating the Nazis and the Japanese, this showed the world that we are not to be messed with. The U.S. went from being just one country in the world to being the nation that every other country went to for help. By the end of the war, the United States had the highest amount of the world's resources, including the world's gold, oil, and best scientific and intellectual minds ever known in human history. In only a 20-year period, the United States went from being in the grip of extinction to being one of the most powerful countries in the world. This was only possible due to the hardworking spirit that every American displayed during the 4 years encompassing the Second World War. These 2 decades were what generated the energy that would eventually build our 21st century world. If it weren't for these 2 decades, then we wouldn't be where we are today. This is because the U.S. alone was able to accomplish things in those decades that they never thought were possible, including building the Hoover Dam, winning the Second World War, and creating the first ever nuclear weapon. It was because of their hard work that we are able to be where we are today. You have just listened to Back to the Past, Present, and Future. I hope this has helped you understand more how the events of the past can have a huge impact on what happens 10, 20 years later. I hope you enjoyed this segment, and I hope you have a great day. See you next time on
Back to the
Past, Present, and
Future!